Welcome back to Sustainable Views, the podcast looking at sustainability issues in depth. My name is Philippa Nuttall and I'm editor of Sustainable Views. So today I have the pleasure of speaking to Bart Vandewaetere, Vice President of Government Relations and ESG Engagement for Nestlé. And today we're going to be speaking about the EU Deforestation Regulation, or the EUDR in short. Hi Bart, thank you for being with us today.
Hi Philippa, thanks for
inviting me.
Great to see
you. So for anyone who hasn't been following the EUDR, I'll try and give a quick overview of the situation before we I start speaking to Bart, because it's quite confusing as to what's happening, even for the vagaries of us who are used to EU policymaking. So basically, the law is aimed at stopping the importation of certain commodities, such as cocoa, leather, wood, from land that has been deforested. It should normally have been implemented 2 years ago, but it's now twice been delayed. Once in December 2024 and then in December 2025. And the regulation has had wide opposition from the US, from countries such as Brazil, from within the EU, and with certain industries such as the leather industry, which is still fighting to be excluded or to have the regulation delayed even further. At the end of the month, the European Commission is going to come out with some form of simplification, but we're not quite sure what. And meanwhile, among all this sort of mess and uncertainty, various companies such as Nestlé have been working to implement the regulation. And so today I wanted to speak to Bart and just to find out kind of how you work with all this uncertainty and just what you've been doing to actually implement it, and to try and find out a little bit more where the real problems are and the issues. So thanks for being with us to try and clarify all this a little bit. And perhaps you can just start by saying how you feel with all this uncertainty and the kind of delay or twice delay in terms of an implementation of a regulation.
Look, it's not an easy thing, this delay. Just maybe to say a few words on the deforestation regulation. I don't like actually deforestation. It should be deforestation-free regulation.
You're right.
Because that's already somehow something that went wrong from the start. So it was maybe not spelling well. But I think just to say that from a company perspective, we have always supported the principles behind this regulation. First of all, we have started more than a decade. I think it's more than 15 years ago that we have started in a voluntary way to really super proactively work on that. And when you look at where we are, and we look to basically the 6 key commodities like palm, cocoa, coffee, and so on, we are now globally, so not only European, we are 97% deforestation free through our supply chains, which is a good achievement. We would have liked to be at 100 already, but then there is sometimes practical constraints. It's not necessarily that deforestation is happening in the last 3%, but it's just that we cannot be 100% sure about that it's verified and things like that. So the EUDR, or what it brings to us ultimately, is certainly it brings cooperation between everybody and alignment that we need to work together on this. Because, of course, when you look at our supply chains, and I mentioned to you some of those commodities, those supply chains, there are several steps between us and the first step, which is usually the farmer. And all of them, including the governments, not only here in Europe, but notably those also in the countries of origin, they need to be aligned on the goal to have deforestation-free supply chains. And this was actually from the very start, when we started in a voluntary way, one of the most challenging things, because you need to basically convince one after the other to go with you and do the efforts that are needed. And I think that's, in our view, this law helps really to set mentally, okay, we need to cooperate, we need to go in this direction, and let's now achieve it together. And we define the roles and the responsibilities of what everybody can contribute to. And I think this should be the key element of this law, that it facilitates really that cooperation, and that the objective of deforestation-free supply chains comes closer and faster closer, I would say. So that's maybe as an introduction how. Then you were asking me about the situation of the 2 reviews that we already got. I can tell you that's very difficult, because in reality, we are ready, because we are so close globally already to that goal. And here we are talking about products that are then entering into the European market. But of course, you can only be ready, completely ready, if you have complete clarity as well how this will function. And if the rules of the game are changing, your goalpost is also changing. And actually, the changes that were made were, the deadlines, but sometimes it were also kind of, we can no longer use the IT system of the European Commission, so you need to reprogram part of the things that you were doing. So in reality, it has nothing to do with the fact if our supply chains are already deforestation free, but it has more to do with the fact how you prove to the legislator or to the enforcement body that actually you are. So it's more about providing the right documentation, the geolocations, these statements, these due diligence statements that we provide. So it's more the way how you show proof that you are deforestation rather than to be deforestation free, because in reality we are in essence already deforestation free. And so this changing goalpost, this is really complex to manage. And if there is one thing super important for a business, it's predictability. And notably for a company like ours, we are, when we are clear about what we have to do, we are kind of like a machine. We will get there. We will allocate the resources, we will allocate the people, and they will work to that goal. Then if it's unclear what it is about or the goalpost changes, of course, you can never be 100% ready, but we are, as much as we can, we are ready to comply, I would say.
Okay, and just in terms of the scale of actually checking whether your supply chains are deforestation free, I mean, you said you started a decade ago. Can you give us a sense of, I don't know how many suppliers there are or how you work with, how you work out who's actually there, and perhaps also a sense of the teams that you've put into place and even the amount you've spent in terms of trying to, comply with the EUDR?
Yeah, so I'll give you one example of cocoa. It's personally the sector that I know the best as well, and I have been on the ground on that. So you will hear maybe more examples on that, but then if needed, I can provide afterwards even more information to the listeners about this. But for example, in cocoa, we are likely supplying from some 160,000 farmers. Many of them are in West Africa. So you can imagine, if you look at the prescriptions of the law, you need to know then the geolocations of those farms and from where we are supplying. So basically, it all starts, the main principle of the EUDR is really, and that's also the main principle, by the way, of our voluntary action, is to create traceability. And that's basically starting by knowing where they are. So you map your supply chain, basically, and then you are going to verify with different tools what's happening there. It can be somehow paperwork. Is there forest anyway? Because some of the areas there is simply no forest where we cultivate, so there is no risk as well. Or you need to check the history because you have these cut-off dates and so on. But also you have, for example, satellite monitoring where you can follow the things. Then you have on-the-ground verification where we or our partners, the cooperatives, for example, that work with these farmers, can go on the ground and can check the situation. And then, and we can maybe talk about in more detail about that, then we have the certification bodies. For example, we work with Rainforest Alliance that really are auditing the system. And this is for us, this has been a very powerful experience to really prove the traceability and to see where the cocoa is moving from there on the ground to basically Europe, and we can track every step in the supply chain.
And so to make that happen, I mean, you have to sometimes take on personnel, you obviously have to spend a certain amount of money. Can you give us a sense of the number of people you've had to employ and the amount you've had to spend?
This was obviously several millions. We are obviously a big company. We are in many of those commodities that are listed in the law. So this is somehow normal that there was quite some, but then the basics of the system are very similar, obviously. And then for a number of time, we got around, I believe, 40 people working on this. Not that they are working like completely 100% on this, but it's part of their project management work. And this is a bit, you can imagine when I come back to your first question and you say predictability and these changes, well, all of a sudden last year we understood, and I think for good reasons, that the European Commission said, oh, our system will likely fail if we have to basically manage all this kind of information. I can understand that. But it means that part of the use of this, we were building an interface that was thinking, okay, the EU system will do this, that, and that. And all of a sudden, it can only do one part of what was promised. So then basically, they shifted that responsibility on us. So now we are rebuilding or enhancing our own IT infrastructure to be able to manage that.
I think everybody found it a bit strange that the Commission said just a month before or so, or even less before implementation was supposed to happen, that their IT system couldn't quite work. It seemed to be a bit of a last-minute decision.
Yes, and then I think I at least for that part, I'm happy that the European Commission has done it, and that because we were speaking also directly with the officials in charge, because we were also having questions on that. Imagine that they would have started and that the system would have collapsed. Imagine we would have blocked supply chain for let's say that element. So I think luckily they have done it. I would say, of course, we would have preferred if we would have known before the regulation was adopted that such a system was maybe not feasible. But okay, that's another thing.
And you talked about working with, obviously you have lots of small scale suppliers. One of the concerns around the regulation that's been cited is that lots of small scale suppliers might find it difficult to comply with the regulation. Either they haven't got the technology or for other reasons, and therefore that certain big companies may just decide they're not going to work with smaller companies anymore, and instead work with farms that are parts of cooperatives or bigger farms, because they'll be easier to track because they've got the technology or whatever in place. Have you had to stop working with any of the smaller farms because they just can't help you, sort of give you the information you need to comply with the EUDR?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a very good question, referring back to the cocoa supply chain, but you have it also in part in the palm oil sector, in the coffee sector. You have a lot of smallholder farms. Let's be very clear on that. And most of the cocoa farms in West Africa are very small farms. And I think for us, imagine we would just ditch them. This will not work. We need them. We need their supply. So we need them on board. So I think it's very important to understand that we are not like discriminating on size. What is important for us, that the supply chains are deforestation free. And that's our criterion. And if we cannot guarantee a deforestation free supply chain, whoever small or big, they can unfortunately not be in our supply chain. Let's face it. Important is, of course, that we are helping. We are helping also with our cooperatives. There is an education part. And as I explained before, in reality, for the farmers, it is not so complex. Once they are in the system, once we have the polygons, they have their unique ID, we are checking if there is a deforestation risk. And then we are checking if they are complying with the local law, what they call legality. If you have done those three things, and we have our certification provider, Rainforest, that is coming on the ground and working to check in and so on, and not only to control, but also to guide together with the cooperatives and our own people there. You actually do not necessarily see that this is a big issue for the farmers.
And do you see for Nestlé there's a business case as well as an environmental case around the EUDR? Because a lot of the opposition, some of it has been from companies, but also a lot of it seems to have been political. So, I mean, can you kind of make that argument that this can be good for business as well as good for the environment?
I think this is really the key question that we need to discuss. If I look at it, we are coming from a period where maybe the policymakers were completely focused on sustainability and the Green Deal, even though I remember von der Leyen said it's also a competitiveness strategy. But many of the laws were like pushed one after the other in this direction. Now we are in a new von der Leyen Commission, and all of a sudden we are talking about competitiveness. But actually, it's a fake polarization that has been made, honestly, because in reality, at the intersection of this competitiveness on the one hand and sustainability on the other hand, there is business resilience and security of supply. And I think if we would all be able to look at that, that would move us really to the next step. Because in reality, we have always seen in the past as well that sometimes, yes, you are faced with challenges and you are faced with indeed upfront costs. And that's what it's ultimately about. You have upfront costs, but ultimately mid and long term, you have returns. You have returns in terms of your consumer prefers your product because, it's obviously deforestation free, and the consumer wants this ultimately. Maybe doesn't want to pay for it, but certainly wants this. Secondly, the security of supply. I come back to that. First, we got the consumer preference, then the security of supply. This is a very important element, because I think if you look at it, for example, on coffee and the coffee areas that are suitable to cultivate coffee at this stage, in 20 years from here, 20, 25 years, half of them might no longer be there due to climate change. And deforestation is part of that. So if we don't address it, we are just going to create issues for ourselves, for the whole industry as well. So it's very important to look at that. And yes, I repeat, it requires an upfront cost, but the benefits will come. And I think it's part of good company governance to include business resilience, security of supply, and consumer trust.
And do you think those arguments of resilience, I mean, they kind of seem to, as you say, sustainability sort of almost disappeared in the last couple of years, and we've seen a lot of simplification from the European institutions. We've got a bit more potentially coming out on the EUDR, and it's being kind of called in the name of business, that actually this makes businesses easier to operate and makes them more competitive. But what you're saying is this is a false argument. Now with the war in Iran and this kind of increasing call for resilience, do you think this could shift back a bit, and actually initiatives like the EUDR could actually gain more support now, because there is this kind of resilience argument which is very real?
Yeah, no, I think we also need to be intellectually honest that some of the regulations obviously have come with quite some administrative burden, and that's true. And sometimes that's the price we have to pay to get a regulation, maybe in Europe, because we know the process. One country thinks this, a parliamentarian thinks that, and it's all being added. In the end, it's all well intended, but we have forgotten what it means. So I think having a regulation that makes sure that the least administrative burden is is needed is good practice, obviously. And it would be stupid for me to say that this is not holding true for Nestle. However, at a certain point in time, you need to just accept this is what it is. And we need to get on with it. And we need to program the systems and so on. But if you continue to change it, if you change a legislation by a legislation, which has been done, you do not necessarily simplify, you just change the goalpost and businesses need to continue to combine. Obviously, those that have not started to comply in the first place or making them ready to comply, they benefit because they have not programmed anything and they think it can be delayed eternally. But I think those companies should also look at what I mentioned before, really their resilience, the resilience of the sector they are in, the consumer trust in our sector as well, because maybe now the consumer is focused on something else because it's a very difficult time. But the consumer, it's all cyclical, I'm sure.
And are you concerned that there could be other delays now? I mean, we've got this sort of simplification from the Commission due at the end of April. One of the big opponents of the EUDR has been the US, and we know that in the EU-US trade deal, there is kind of this paragraph around the EUDR suggesting it shouldn't have any impacts on trade with the US. I mean, are you concerned, or do you think now it's kind of been understood and there'll just be a few sort of simplifications around the edges, but you expect it to be implemented by the end of the year?
Yeah, good question. Honestly, I would be very concerned if we reopen again the regulation. I think there are many different ways how to help to manage the implementation. I will mention a few. There is, of course, frequently asked questions that were promised and that will come out together with some guidance. So I think this is very good. So let's review that on their merits so that we have final clarity on a number of elements. For example, what we at this stage do not necessarily, sometimes if you read, and this gets technical, I'm sorry for that, sometimes you can be a downstream operator, sometimes you can be a trader, or you can be even sometimes the same thing at the same time, or different things at the same time, sorry. So this needs to be clarified a little bit so that everybody has a clear understanding of that, but you don't need a law for that. There is a definition and then there is an interpretation of that. So, and it needs to be common. That's the most important, and harmonized. Then there is this IT system I mentioned to you before. Part of that has been shifted to the companies to basically program themselves how they are going to work with that system, because the system will only be available for use for certain actions and no longer for all the actions that were foreseen. So we need to have clarity on some of them if we can maybe use it a little bit more than what is foreseen by the law, because that would be super helpful and that would really limit some of the burden put on operators, be it big or small companies. So I think that's also important there. And I think what we have proposed, and we did it with a group that also has NGOs in it, companies, certifiers as well, like Fairtrade, Rainforest, and so on. We have proposed a community of practice, and a community of practice. And actually, the first meetings took already place. They are public. Those meetings, they were streamed even.
Could you just explain a little bit what that is and who would be involved in it?
Well, basically, the whole supply chain can be involved, can be following it. Then, of course, they have, for practical reasons, they have made sometimes some smaller groups to work on specific cases and so on, or to bring up the attention. But what is good in this community of practice is that you will have all the actors, first of all, but you also have European Commission representative, member state representative, because ultimately the EUDR is enforced, controlled by the member states, notably at customs, for example, when it gets imported, or other kind of agencies. So they are there. And basically, you can openly discuss with them, and you can really build also on best practice and of experience. And you can also ensure then that every country will apply the same way. And the Commission from their end, they can build on experience because we are doing ourselves sometimes dry runs with some of the companies, some others as well. Different sectors have different dry runs. This experience can be brought in. The best practice can be included in the FAQs or the guidance document or wherever they want. And I think this is now the way how to sort it out and not to reopen this regulation again, because I think we are clear now this will not bring any further benefits to anybody, only changing of goalposts, but not changing fundamentally things. So let's do it from an on-the-ground experience, best practice-based approach, I would say.
And you said that Nestlé was 90% compliant. Does that mean by the end of the year you'll be 100% compliant?
So, to be clear, 97% or close, I think 96.7, but okay. It's the last bit. But this is our global commitment for deforestation-free supply chains in our biggest commodities, which are basically also the ones that are included in the EUDR. But this is globally, so this is not only European. We are very convinced that we will be 100%. So it's just a matter now of doing the final bits of the IT system, the interconnection with the European IT system, some of the practical aspects, what exactly you need to prove to the authorities that will enforce the law and so on. So it's more of understanding how they will verify and what kind of documentation on top of the one that you dryly see defined in the law they will require. Okay. So this is now more the topic. So it's not about that we lack sourcing from deforestation-free supply chains. It's more the way how you prove with DDSs, geolocations, and other kind of documentation and compliance with legality. For example, how you prove that your farmers there are in compliance with the local law. Mm-hmm. You can have a pragmatic approach, or you can have such an administrative approach that nobody can follow anymore, and that 10,000s of papers need to be brought to the table. So this is exactly what you cannot regulate and what you will never be able to regulate. This is what you need to define together in this community of practice. But I repeat, the most important thing is that the principles are always safeguarded, and the biggest principle is really this traceability, because if you start with traceability, you can identify immediately, okay, could there be issues there? You monitor them, and then your documentation starts to prove that your traceability and all the actions around that are being done in a proper, diligent way, ultimately.
And in terms of the fact that there still are businesses and politicians who are still opposing the deforestation regulation, what either advice or message would you like to send to them to kind of either say, yeah, this is how you can manage it, or, what needs to happen now? What do they need to understand?
No, I think they should be part of this community of practice and bring forward also, be it themselves or be it through their national organizations, they should bring forward their practical barriers that they might have, their questions, because they are legitimate. Let's face it, we also have them and they also have them. So bring forward your questions. Let them discuss, be it at local level, but ideally at European level, so that we have an approach that is uniform across Europe. So I think this is fundamental. This is one thing, how they will get compliant. And secondly, if the topic is more fundamental, I would really encourage their boardrooms to look at what it brings as benefits. Yes, as I mentioned before, there is an upfront cost, there is an investment, but what we have seen, it pays back mid-term, long-term, because it's all about security of supply. It's all about also avoiding ultimately inflation that will happen if we are not properly governing our supply chains. And deforestation is kind of something we don't want, because this contributes to actually not a resilient system. And we want a resilient system and a reliable system. And that's what we need to work on. And I think everybody in the food system should be aware about that. If you're big or small, this is your obsession ultimately. Because without raw materials, there's no chocolate, there's no coffee. Sorry to say, but it's like that.
Yeah, and we've seen the fluctuations in cocoa prices, or massive fluctuations in recent years. So as you say, understanding your supply chains helps you mitigate that much more easily. Well, that's a great message to end on, is that idea of needing to master your supply chain, and very relevant for what's happening in the world at the moment when the Strait of Hormuz is still closed as we're recording this podcast. So thank you very much, Bart, for speaking to me. I think it was really interesting and great to hear exactly what's happening very practically on the ground, instead of just the theory of regulation. And thanks to our listeners. If you want to listen to more podcasts or read about our journalism around the EUDR and other EU regulations, please go to sustainableviews.com.